Onwards with a another extension from the last video. This is going to be mostly around how God rewards efforts and how we don't really need to have a mathematical way of calculating how God rewards or how the universe sort of reciprocates any kind of uh, effortful and ethical action that's in the world that we try to kind of embody. So, one of the verses that I want to start with was the one that says, and I'll link this as well, the reminder to be conscious of God and He will teach us how to be in the world is one. And then the other is there isn't a, the analogy is a mustard seed. So if you've actually seen a mustard seed, it looks like a little pebble. Like it's hardly kind of discernible. If you're not really looking, you won't find it. But God wants to say less than that is an atom. He says there's nothing that you can do, even if it is an atom's weight, that won't be rewarded. And another kind of analogy that's given is if you eat a date or you pull one apart, like a date fruit, usually you'll find this really thin layer that's on top of the pit. And if you measure it, like the scale probably won't even read it. So it says even if it's that little effort that you're putting forth, it's going to be rewarded. And God won't uh, almost oppress you in a way by not acknowledging that. So it's almost like God won't even oppress you the weight of what that thin layer is. So almost to say that God does keep account, but not in a way that any human mind can actually grasp. So it's almost to say if God is able to show you in that minute detail what you in like a really, really big way have absolutely nothing to worry about, then your imagination can basically take you wherever it wants to and just rely on God to kind of assist you in a way that's going to be kind of commensurate with what the kind of social norm is. And if it's the social norm is like too dogmatic in some way or holding you back, then maybe like ask for inspiration for how can I find the means to overcome whatever it is that's kind of like an obstacle for me. So I left in the kind of commentary of my last video the story of Solomon as kind of depicted in the Quran. And I wanted to kind of give uh, kind of something to kind of balance what we might understand about colonies and nations. We don't really know anything about, well, I'm sorry, I should say it like that. We know a little bit about the language that happens within different animals. We don't necessarily know what they mean. It's kind of like a mother and a child. Uh, a mother will know what the kind of cry of each child of her child is, and maybe across all her children if she has several, what each cry kind of indicates, and then how to respond. And we kind of have an approximation of that within different kind of animal kingdoms. So the story of Solomon indicates that we have God sort of talks about how the birds have a certain kind of logic that is a a sort of language that is discernible to humans, but it's kind of intuitive. So if you think about it as melody and tone, think of anybody who listens to music or appreciates music or can kind of tell different nuance between different notes. They don't necessarily have to speak about it. If they just play it, they can notice, and it's unspoken, right? It's just having a really good ear, and then like maybe something resonates with you in a certain way. So if somebody plays something, and they make a mistake, they'll be like, no matter how. So if you think of Beethoven, he's somebody who was tone deaf, or like was deaf, and yet look at the music that he created. And the reason I'm able to kind of appreciate this is when I spent that year in a private school, we had that like that kind of like the bulk of our day was to review what we had memorized and then recite it to like our teacher at the time. And if we recited something that had some kind of error in maybe the pronunciation of a word, not necessarily an inaccurate word, like that could be a completely different error that needs to be kind of modified, but it's just the kind of pronunciation because it has certain accents. They pick up on it and they say, well, wait, go back. And then they'd listen, like, no, something's wrong. And then they might open the actual like scripture and say, well, wait, oh, this is what it is. So it's almost like the mind has actually memorized or like absorbed a certain tune or a certain melody around, not necessarily knowing, like if they don't speak the actual language, Arabic, just hearing it and knowing that, if even if I didn't understand the language and know that those words won't go together, just because of the way it's recited, I'll know that there was an error somewhere and I'll have to ask you to go back or I'll have to study it myself. And it'll just kind of like create this a little bit like a discomfort where you're like, no, no, something's wrong and I have to get the right one. And then after they kind of recognize what it is, they can go forward. So if you understand birds, you think, like, wow, like what diversity do we have with birds? And then you think, oh, okay, if we get to humans, then you can think, yeah, we can see why we don't really know how to appreciate the diversity that we have within one culture, one society, and the diversity within, even if it looks kind of uniform in some way, and then to kind of extrapolate that or take it like outside from like a global perspective, it's just like it's actually more of a miracle that we can all understand each other in spite of the diversity that we all carry. So any way you kind of look at it, it's still kind of like mind boggling and it kind of just gives you pause and you're like, wow, that is really something to kind of ponder and marvel at. So I'm going to think about the verse where um, I think before talking about what Solomon and David inherited from the time of Adam and kind of gnosis and understanding something about God and living on earth, is a valley of ants. And one of the ants, she almost sees Solomon and his army or his kind of population of jinn men and birds, as it were. They're kind of coming. And as you can see, like sometimes if you're walking on the sidewalk, you'll see just like an ant hill. But have you ever crossed where there's like maybe two ant hills and between the two is it's like basically like a highway and not even like exaggerating, like it'll be like a lot of ants just going back and forth and you just wonder like that's quite a number in a population. Like what are they like underground? So if you think of that and you think of just like one person walking across, they might think, I don't know, what do they think? Like, is this person just going to bypass us or like, is it going to be a problem? Probably not. But if they think of an army coming, they won't stand a chance. So then she says to her kind of colony, like, you have to move because he's coming, like this force is coming and we're going to be trampled and we'll be gone. So if you think of that and like as a story, and it could be like a fable or kind of like a mythical narrative, and then you take that out to some of the niches. So if I think of like a conservative community within any of the world religions, and they are listening to one of my videos and they think, like, wow, postmodern understanding of religion is a lot of like cerebral thought outside of like having reliance on something that's kind of metaphysical or transcendence. Like, oh my gosh, like I have to do this as an adult, and then I have to think of like, oh my gosh, like I've been teaching my kids one thing, and now I have to like, do I divert them? Do I just start to embody like a postmodern view, and then see what they notice, and then how they ask and how they respond, and then it's like a conundrum because you're like, there's going to be this kind of like, I don't know how to configure, like, how do I, there's going to be a chasm. So you might think of that as a story where if you know that you are going to be grappling with that kind of, um, it's almost like this possible conundrum. I don't even know what the words are, but it's exactly that where I can't really explain something. And yet I need you to understand the importance of me not explaining it. So I'm almost encouraging you to continue to rely on me. But as I'm kind of going forth and finding an individual path, I want you to do the same. And doing that will help us keep what we know of our tradition without negating it, but it'll also help us sort of understand how to acclimate to whatever this new climate of postmodern life is. You can think of that's what the ants is, like what her and her colony are, is that basically they're saying, if we jump into like a secular life from being really conservative, really traditional right away, we might flounder. Like we'll be like fish out of the water. Be like, like so. Just think of like somebody who is 18, who never thought of drinking alcohol, has no idea what to expect around, being careful, no idea about sexual education, and then they decide, well, the postmodern life says you're welcome to go and explore whatever your interests are, right? The first thing they do is find out what friends of mine are having a party. I don't want to go, right? So they just think, well, whatever, we're just gonna go have a party and we'll maybe meet some friends, maybe dance, listen to loud music, have some food, and then go home. But then they go, and maybe people are experimenting with marijuana, with alcohol, people are already engaging in sexual activity. And for them, that might be like a shock to their system. Like, I was not at all aware that this was a norm within this age group, and I am not prepared to even understand how to grapple with this. And what do I do? And that might scare them and actually retreat them from wanting to explore further. And so then they're not necessarily going backwards into tradition, but it's almost like, who do I talk to? Like, how do I know what does my tradition tell me about moving forward and how to do so, like in a very, very like kind of incremental process? And then if I talk to somebody, are they going to call me like a heretic or like gone astray or like these words that come up as, you've left your tradition? And so these ideas are, because they're very new, it's just like you can relate that story to Solomon and say, if a tradition or like a community that's based on a tradition that is sort of slow to kind of acclimate to a secular worldview or a postmodern worldview wants to, sorry, if that community wants to try, but it doesn't want to do so as a collective, like what would be something to kind of hold as a foundation other than, like we mentioned, the idea of gratitude and God's grace being that the more that you are acknowledging God's almost gift of reminding you to be grateful, then you have nothing to worry about. But that's an act of faith, right? And if people are almost like, okay, I'm going to rely on that, but then I still have to kind of enter into the world. And then as I'm trying things, I have to know why. And I still have to build that language. And then I have to understand why I'm giving up a practice or why I'm maintaining a practice and then understanding what's the origin story. That takes a lot of time. So we almost have to be forgiving of ourselves for this like transition, almost as it were. Um, Somebody referred to it as kind of growing pains, where it's a very reluctant process. We don't realize that we're habituated to a way of thinking that looks like it's religious or it's pious or righteous or, it's somehow devotional and it's comfortable for us. And yet it's somehow hindering our growth in the way that would allow us to be able to integrate with the broader culture in a way that helps us basically assimilate with each other, have like a common understanding without feeling like we have to be judgmental of anybody. Uh, and then, with bearing all that in mind, how do I do that without a support that's been built yet? So it's basically we're trying not to be spiritually slothful, but we're all doing this at the same time and we're all new to it and we're at different levels of acknowledging that we need to do this. So people who have been, maybe secular for a very long time, maybe already moved out of a Protestant way of thinking, and they're just kind of like, I'm going to just call myself agnostic, right? They might already have a way of understanding the universe that they don't really talk about, but they spiritually understand that there is something bigger than just me in the universe. And then you might have people who are still quite traditional and are hesitant to do any kind of thinking around their tradition needing some kind of reformation or enlightenment or kind of revival of what the fundamentals or the spirit of their understanding of life and tradition are. And so to kind of be uh, almost presented with that as an idea might be like, no, like they're kind of still resistant to it. And so maybe that's the best place to be. Like, okay, well, you don't want to, and that's fine. Now think about why you don't want to and why you might need to. So people who are uh, maybe certain that, genders are just male and female, I don't want to think about anything other than that. Then you might say, okay, that's fine. But why would you wonder about why some people feel like they want to be gender fluid and want to approximate an understanding of male and female norms as like, why do we socialize males one way and females another way outside of what their actual biology is, right? That could just be like, okay, we'll just start there and then think about how we react to men and women. And then you can think of the stories of uh, kind of like eschatology stories that talk about the end of time, but we don't have to think of it as the end of time. But it's almost, if we were to think of heaven as a place, what would men and women look like? Would there be like gender norms? And then you can think of it from that way, because that's still something that you hold dear and you're kind of believing in. But now you have to kind of bring it to, well, what if life and death is kind of like a successive cycle? And that is mentioned in the Quran, that it's a successive cycle that doesn't seem to have an end, but it's just a progressive sort of closer approximation to a heavenly existence. So the the story goes on to talk about how, in spite of what Solomon wanted for himself, of, God grant me the knowledge of this kingdom or give me this massive kingdom that won't be something that's acquired by anybody after me, he still has that bird that is able to almost go against what his directive was or his authority and inform him on top of that that there's something outside of your realm of knowledge. So it's a beautiful understanding of how God is allowing us as humans to say and know that, regardless of the time and place, whatever kind of power you reach or affluence or prestige in the world, know that even if you reach the height of Solomon, which, I mean, in this day and age, anything that has to do with jinn might be a little bit scary rather than kind of reassuring. But even if you were to reach that height, he is constantly remembering to praise God. And he's constantly also aware that God is reminding him that with what you have, you are still humble in the fact that you are allowing yourself to accept like humility or some kind of humble acknowledgement that your knowledge still won't reach God's expansive knowledge. So it's to say that people who decide to have some kind of pious life, they don't have to be. Sometimes they're associated with asceticism, some kind of renouncing any kind of worldly or material gain or benefit or luxury. And it doesn't have to be like that. Like the story of Solomon almost indicates that you can have a king who is devout and understands how to balance life and luxury without seeming extravagant in any way. Muhammad, when was given the choice, would you rather be a prophet that's a king or a slave? And he chose a slave because he said, I would rather work towards a final um, end that constantly is approximating a closer endeavor to God. So it's almost like saying, I want to start at the beginning and find out how to meet God uh, at the end of my kind of lifespan, as it were. And also, it tends to be that those who are looked at in history as prophets or as people who have knowledge or wisdom, they tend to somehow just be people who are uh, they're kind of like wayfarers, right? It's almost like I think of Mother Teresa when I think of this. It's just like people who are they have maybe because they're able to kind of escape the zeitgeist or that social pressure of like maintaining a certain norm or tradition, that they are almost without the burden of like, how do I worry about money? How do I worry about how to think about like how to dispense with it? How do I think about keeping like the status quo, right? If they're kind of relieved of all that, then their joy and happiness is just, I just need to get through this day, make sure, I make it through without harming anybody and then try again the next day. So it's a very simple way of living that's almost stress free. And you kind of wonder, like, what was the wisdom in asking that? And it could be that it is because he wanted to promote a way of life that is merciful, which would not be one that is antagonistic to any particular form of life. So being like the most impoverished to, the height of all success, you'll find something in this way of living and thinking that you can relate to and that you can kind of try to tie into your life. So I'm going to tie that in with something of uh, what we can understand if we wanted to acknowledge that we are uh, susceptible or we have the potential to be inspired. And yet we don't want to kind of call ourselves a prophet because we already know that this final scripture is almost meant to remain open ended and it will be something that is in some way preserved in the world so that it has like it's very open ended that it has a lot of interpretations and a lot of manifestations of kind of uh, embodying itself in the world. So the the Quran actually mentions of a few people. I think I mentioned this before. People who just get inspired. So Moses' mother was one of them. Um, I think Joseph's brother was another one, or Joseph himself. And then we talk about bees being inspired. And it's almost to say these are people who are known to be prophets, except for and Mary. So it's difficult to say how we should understand women who were inspired and weren't called prophets. So maybe it could have been something that's relevant to the time and the context of the time of the prophet. But in any case, I want to wonder with you about how um, God wants us to understand that knowledge will continue to increase in commensurate measure to the amount of effort people put into the world to try to understand the universe and God. So if God says, if you're patient, I'll give you an accountable reward. If you ask for my assistance to learn and you're trying to be like an ethical, God conscious person, I'll continue to uh, inspire you with learning. And then you think, the final one is if you have a misstep, you can just follow it by a positive, and that'll erase whatever's past and it'll continue to give you increase. And then be charitable with yourself and with others. And then try to understand where you need to have impulse control. So you think of that and you think that's pretty, like that's basically all I need. It's like a toolkit for life. And then you think, well, I don't know I don't know how to think of myself if I was to think of myself as able. So you think, okay, well, Cain maybe had a sort of assertive way of being with the life where he was kind of very proactive and he wanted to kind of grapple and figure out, like maybe if you think of a person who's like a rancher or a farmer, where they're willing to kind of put the effort of like domesticating a wild horse or training one, right? It's a lot of effort. And so if you think of all of humanity's history being that kind of persona, maybe an extrovert, and then you're thinking of Abel, who may be an introvert. You think, how do I begin this journey? Like, I don't know how to, like, what step do I take with God? And that's exactly it. It's almost, if we made it through civilization with this much inspiration and this much, um, almost facilitation, and God giving us the prophets, then you think of Abel and you think, and he's now saying, we don't need prophets. We all have the potential to find a story and relate to one to kind of, uh, see how we can tie it into our personal life and then kind of go from there. Just rely on God. So it's this kind of what Ibrahim was, like someone who's inclining to truth, called a Hanif or a monotheist. So what I did was uh, kind of want to kind of debunk that prophecy that we somehow may have misinterpreted. I don't know, but it says that at the end of time, um, there will be a sort of guide who will come into the earth or come into the world and sort of lead humanity, into the kingdom of God. So some people may say, so we're waiting for this, like we want this day of judgment to come. But we may want to, maybe before thinking of that prophecy, just think about, well, what kind of traditions are there in the world and how do I want to see how I can have them all integrate with each other? So I can maybe just be that for myself, like somebody who is a guide for how I want to understand the world. So it's almost taking on a postmodern approach for yourself and being your own guide. And then you kind of think, well, yeah, I mean, I can see that, being a possibility. And then the kind of positive way of looking at that is, if you think, if there was to be some kind of, soul leader for the whole world, what would that look like? Like, what would the application of that look like if heaven is not really a place outside this earth? And I just have to contend with the fact that I'm going to be constantly born and reborn in this life on this world, like this earth, for eternity. Right? It kind of gives you pause and you have to kind of think like, wow, that really reframes like everything I thought I believed and understood about life and death and rebirth. And that's good because then you can understand why there's a story of Muhammad when uh, I think it was before he went to Medina, he had a night journey. And then, so he went from Mecca to Jerusalem. And from there, he ascended to the heavens. And that's where he met God. And he had the kind of ordinance to establish prayer and show his community how to pray. So it's almost to say that prayer is what is going to give you that closeness. It's that really, really quiet and very personal, almost call that's, if God's almost saying like his closest love of all creation is being called that close to God, a point after which no person has ever been before. Like even Angel Gabriel had never actually gone to that point. Then you understand like, wow, humans can actually supersede angels. And you kind of wonder like, what is it about prayer? And like, what is the nature? Like you want a tangible kind of understanding of it. And it is faith. Like it's something that's, you just feel this almost quiet if you listen to some kind of symphony and you're just still and you just absorb the sound and maybe just close your eyes and you just listen to the rhythm. That's basically what prayer can do for a person. It'll just take them to another world and just let them sort of let their mind relax and their body relax into it and hopefully kind of remove any kind of worry or stress about the world. So if we know that, then you can think, okay, so I'm not looking for like a way of having a soul leader in the world. God is that over and above everything. If I am trying to find a leader and there isn't something that I can kind of rely on as a person or like a guru or anything like that, you know, without any mediation, I could just have like a private prayer within myself and I'll be inspired. Um, any kind of prayer that I choose to kind of engage in will be accepted because God says directly, if anyone, he says to the prophet, if anybody asks you concerning me, he's saying, uh, he doesn't say tell them, he just says, I am close. So even like afterwards, if people are reading this, they won't assume that, the prophet has to be a mediation. It's just like God's telling you directly as you're reading it, I am close to the person who calls if they choose to call. And when they do, they will find that I am going to facilitate for them a way to align and to make their life kind of easier for them in a way that they would wish. So from that, we can understand, okay, so prayer is something that we're kind of going to focus on. Like, I just want to learn this internal dialogue with myself and the supreme being. Now, what else can I know about heaven then? And this is where we understand what the prophet met and who he met during that ascension. So the first level of heaven, he met Adam. The second level, he met John and Jesus. The third, he met Joseph. The fourth, he met Idris, which I think is called Enoch. And then five was Aaron, the brother of Moses. The sixth level was Moses. And then the seventh was Ibrahim. So I gave just a quick synopsis as to um, how we can relate to what their kind of struggle was with their community. And maybe we could use these as kind of hypothetical or metaphorical uh, role models to align with, and then to figure out, well, if I'm going through a divorce, for example, who do I know in history has gone through that? And then you can kind of look and see and wonder, like maybe none, and then I have to kind of figure this out on my own because maybe from as far as because I can remember, divorce wasn't something that was encouraged. Then you get to Muhammad and you say, well, he was contemplating divorce, and one of his most beloved companions had a divorce, and it was fine. It was almost like God said, I'm allowing this as a way to give an example, even though it might seem as though it's something that's not liked or might be kind of judged harshly by your companions. But you are the role model and the one that's there to kind of exemplify mercy for all creation. So if you're doing it, it's therefore okay. So the first, I'm just going to give kind of like a brief kind of what came to my mind when I thought of all these prophets. So the first one for Adam, I said somebody who is new to civilization and our society or culture. So if you think of somebody who's maybe born and raised in anywhere in Africa or Southeast Asia, and they're coming somewhere to Europe or North America or South America, it's probably going to be not much of a culture clash as maybe in a few years ago, because my immigration has been kind of very prevalent, and so people can find kind of little niches within uh, any kind of society. But there's still going to be that kind of gap where, like, you maybe feel homesick. You might feel like I don't know where my niche is yet, because within all these kind of subgroups of a culture, there's still kind of different comforts. Like we might want to say they all look the same, but they won't all think the same. They won't all have the same outlook. So that's something to consider, and that could also kind of help us see how that story of Solomon and the ants kind of integrates. So the ants among the birds and the jinn and the human are a colony, and maybe they're just a niche within, like you can think of maybe like an Amish community or a Mennonite community who are happy to adapt and almost encourage different communities from with making business with them, but they won't necessarily adapt to what a lot of maybe modern practices are or postmodern practices are. So that could be Adam, which is basically, I'd want to assume like all of us, depending on how we're trying to always re-envision how to frame a status quo and then what the zeitgeist is, and then how do we want to kind of grapple with it. And then two was John and Jesus. I put these two as maybe their youth, maybe people who are grappling with chastity and a bachelor life or a bachelorette life. So men or women, basically where we are right now, just wondering about gender fluidity and gender constructs and how do I want to identify. And following that is the story of Joseph, which is the third level of heaven. And he was tested for his attractiveness. He was known to have half the beauty of all humanity. So with him, he was tested with scandal, his family abandoning him, being bought and sold as a slave, and then in spite of all that, not wanting to take shortcuts and remaining like someone of a high ethic, that he ended up working for the king as a finance minister. So he was known for his trustworthiness. And his story in the Quran is it's so comprehensive and so detailed. And at the end of it, God is saying that this story, it's not just a story just for entertainment. Like there's so much you can derive from the story. And it continues to be, and it's actually at the very beginning of the story, it's saying that this is the best of all stories that was revealed to the prophet. So knowing the story of John, Jesus, and Joseph allows for us to maybe wonder about how gender norms are. So typically in some societies, maybe it's not really encouraged for a woman to be the first to kind of make an advance towards a man. Muhammad kind of broke that norm with his first wife. She was the one that kind of proposed to him. So I love that these are kind of archetypical stories that, in spite of their existence, we sometimes still kind of go back to a tradition or a way of thinking that seems comfortable, maybe within some societies and others, but um, understanding how to grapple with them or have to be understanding of them or forgiving of people who are maybe struggling still with outgrowing these is something we should maybe keep in mind. And then the fourth level of heaven is Idris. He's the first prophet after Adam, and he was the one you can assume would be the first to understand, how do I work with the pen? Like what is it that I have the capacity to do? And that's basically everybody right now. So if you think of the fourth level of heaven, excuse me, it's basically all of us right now understanding how to have an ethic with gender relations. So, uh, regardless of what my sexual orientation is and how I choose to identify, how am I going to script my own life? And then how am I going to understand people who may or may not agree with how I live and may choose to somehow stand in my way and maybe challenge the way I choose to identify? So, this is very empowering actually, because if it says this is the first prophet, as it were, after Adam, depending on whether or not you see Adam as a prophet, you can think that's almost saying that you are not certain if he was actually met with any kind of resistant way to the monotheistic way. Like maybe he's just somebody who's like, well, in my community, everybody seems to be worshiping in like some kind of way that aligns with the universe, but maybe I want to write and see what my thoughts are. And that could be something that talks about how there's some kind of mention, I can't remember where it is. Maybe it's in creeds that people kind of write about how to understand theology and studying God. But there's this question of like, when God created, did he create the pen or did he create the book first? Like the book that basically um, includes everything that's going to be written in time. So this is a pretty interesting question and something for everybody to ponder. I guess it's open to interpretation. The fifth level of heaven is Aaron, and he's the one who was trying to follow his brother Moses after he left to kind of see if he can gather the best of his community to go and ask for forgiveness from God, because they were having a very difficult time worshiping God as an unknown without a tangible. So they seem to constantly be falling into some kind of idolatry. So for Aaron, I would assume that his struggle was almost asking for his brother Moses to be patient with him and his followers, because they were stuck in that kind of dogma where they wanted something tangible and they couldn't break out of it enough to go into what Moses was asking of just believe in an ineffable God. And Moses or Aaron seemed to kind of sympathize with it, empathize with them and say, like, I want to listen to them and I want to be like almost become that postmodern approach where I want to see what it is they're grappling with and take my time with them, uh, and see kind of how I can not necessarily override their dogma, but take my time helping them kind of unravel and flesh out what it is that maybe they're struggling with. And then the sixth level of heaven was Moses, and he was restless. He was known to be somebody because he was already adopted by the king's wife or the pharaoh's wife, and so he grew up in the pharaoh's kingdom. And he left, like his story is so involved, like it's just throughout the whole Quran you'll find different synopsis of his story, and it's usually in different contexts depending on the verses that came before and after and based on the chapter and the part in the Quran that it falls in. So I mean, it's just something that everybody can fall on as a narrative that they can apply to their life. But for him it was mostly finding a way to make a living in a climate that doesn't necessarily and hopefully doesn't conflict with a personal ethic. So for him, he was known to be somebody who, in spite of all his struggles and trying to strive to, uh, you know, take on the Pharaoh who raised him and then identify that, I am grateful for what you have done in raising me, but I don't appreciate that you've enslaved like everyone in your kingdom. And because of that, I am impoverished and I do need to leave. And I don't want you all chasing me and trying to kill me because, I killed somebody by accident. And he's trying to find a way to earn a living. And in the end, he does find Jethro, who hires him to work for him and marries one of his daughters. So it's a very contemporary kind of struggle right now. Is people who want a work-life balance, and when they do have a job, they want to somehow align with what their worldview is or how they believe they want to align their life so that they enjoy. Because if you think of your life, like a majority of it is spent at work outside of your family, and you want it to be a life that you enjoy. Like you don't if you spend the majority of your life unhappy with your existence, then it becomes like, what kind of like I have to really stop and reassess, what my goals are and what it is I want to align with. And so having that kind of ethic and knowing that if I hold true to what it is and build an ethic and an intention that I need to find some kind of income that's going to align with that, you will eventually find what it is that's going to kind of come to fruition for you. And then seventh level of heaven is Ibrahim, as we know, and he's the one that's known to be. It's almost like if you think of a daycare, he's known to be somebody who would be sitting under the shade of a tree, and with him would be the children who all died before they hit the age of puberty. So basically, like all the innocent children or all the people who uh, and actually also parents. So it talks about the whole idea of family and separation and death and divorce and how difficult that is and how God rewards the patience when you endure those difficult moments of grief and tragedy. And if we keep it in the lens of we often don't know how to frame life and rebirth and death um, without seeing that it's final, but it's not final, and it's in everyone's best interest, even if we're grieving because of the loss and we miss that kind of place that somebody had in our life. And the aim for Ibrahim, that what we can learn from that is he was somebody who was known as God's friend, as though he was happy to constantly sacrifice for God's sake. So if something was really dear to his heart, he was always tested with it. So first it was his father, then it was his uncle or his uncle. After that, it was his wife, and then his son, his firstborn. After so many years, he had his first son. He had to ask him to leave and live in a distant area from where he was currently residing. And then he had a dream where he had to sacrifice his son, almost to say, like, he's just constantly being tested to remain completely devoted to God and then allowing himself to be in the world without losing that focus. So that's basically everyone's struggle right now is that I want to be postmodern in the world and I don't want to have to look like I'm a devoted person to any kind of uh, affiliated religion or any kind of persuasion. But I just want my ethic to kind of speak to the fact that I am aware that there's a metaphysical existence in the world and I want to align with it. And in spite of the loves and attachments to the world, I can be an aesthetic in that if I lose them, I won't lose my groundedness in who I am as a spiritual person. And in doing so, I am almost someone who is, I think in the Hindu tradition, it's the final stage of yoga as it is. The first one is knowledge, and then I can't remember the second one, and the last one is devotion. So it's like these different paths that you can find to what's called nirvana or this eternal enlightenment, and that's basically what this process sounds like. It's just this constant revision of how to understand how to improve one life to the next. So if I hit nirvana, it's not that it's nothing and I'm just dead. It may just be that I'm coming back as an animal. So my consciousness or my subconscious is more based on instinct. And then if I come back as another human, what is it that I'm going to know about how to kind of build my life already? And if it's something that's close to asceticism, but it's also something that, or someone that enjoys affluence and luxury without being extravagant or somebody who's oppressive, then that's basically enlightenment. So I'm going to stop there. This one was a bit of a long video, but I feel like I don't want us to I don't want us to flounder. Sometimes when I go through these videos and I'm kind of thinking about the commentary, I wonder at families who, like my own, with young children, and they've been, for the first formative 10 years of their life, are kind of almost socialized to believe in the universe doing one thing, and then all of a sudden have to reconsider all that. It could be too much of a shock to the system. Like as an adult, 26, when I kind of started to re-envision how to understand worldviews and societies and religions, it took me so long, like 12 years, and I'm still working on it. So for kids, they're very resilient and their imagination is very rife still, and their abstract thinking is still forming. So it might be easier for some children than others. But going back to what I was mentioning about Muhammad kind of being that final messenger or mercy to the world, some sects within Islam believe that Ali, his fourth successor, was is going to be the final kind of friend of God in the world. And if you think he was a boy who was 10 years old when he first accepted this kind of way of thinking about God, as he's the only one in the universe for you to kind of rely on, and as his messenger, it was Muhammad because it would have been his cousin, and that's all you have to kind of know. And then from there, you can try to see how you can build an ethic. Then you can say, well, then I understand that belief that he is going to be the final guide. Like if we focus on just Muhammad and his cousin and just try to meditate on what their lives were, because they were both rife with tribulation and struggles within families and differences of opinion, then you'll understand, yeah, I can tie in all these other stories of other prophets and see how I can relate to all of them and not feel like I have lost meaning or footing, or my like I have a crisis of faith now because eschatology is not what I thought it would be, and life is eternal now, and I really have to think about how I want to build my life, and it's not going to be uh, a final end, as it were. It's almost like an end and then a beginning, and then an end and then a beginning. So it's I hope none of this information kind of staggers anybody or kind of stunts them or shocks them in any way. It has been kind of a steady process for me, so it's been a kind of gradual one. For somebody who's listening to this, it might seem like really stark and they kind of don't know how to kind of absorb it or take it in. So you're welcome to kind of reach out to me if you'd like. I'm happy to hear. I left and I'll continue to leave them. My blog, themythoftruth.com, is kind of open for people to kind of look through to see how I started my journey. And also, I have my Instagram, Riskiba, and Facebook. I'll link them all at the bottom. And you're welcome to also email me. I'll leave my actual email address there and hope to hear from you all soon.